2, 1. In the obligation of the state to put the best strategies forward to solve large-scale crimes that harm vulnerable groups of people, alternatives to the status quo are obviously not working, and organized crimes are generally becoming harder to clamp down on. We believe that it's only exclusively through proposition that you're able to gain even more solvency in today's issue of the debate I'm proud to propose. Two things I'll do in my speech. First of all, setup, and second of all, arguments. Firstly, on setup, right, on 3 points of definition. Firstly, on states, right, is very generally, these are the very actors in this motion that have the obligation to protect the people in the best means possible. They also use the taxpayer money for state protection and things like that. And we believe that it is in the interest of the state to use these very funds in the most strategic way in solving organized crimes. Secondly, on mercenaries, right, these are for-profit professional soldiers that serves in foreign countries. And on our side of the house, our model is to hire groups of mercenaries with good organizational structure and to respond to one leader in order to have better organizational structure in the end of the day, so that we're able to reach our end goal properly, right? But third of all, most importantly, we also have heavy governmental regulation on these very mercenaries, because even if it's organized crime, right, they still need to preserve human rights. For example, right, on our side, we regulate them if you're detaining groups of organized crime and you're having raids, you still need to have your moral boundaries and not shoot them down when they have their hands up. We believe that this is something that we have on our side of the house to prevent large terrorist acts that kill tons of people. So therefore, in all circumstances, we believe that mercenaries are always going to be the very actor that has the most alternatives that has the best alternatives to solve these type of crimes on our side of the house. Henceforth, we push today's motion. On organized crime, then on definition, right? We think these are things that are like the mafia cartels and do stuff like human trafficking, right? And these are groups of criminals that do illegal activity and are profit-oriented, who have detailed planning and are most of the time are under a centralized system. Henceforth, it's larger to take down. And some even go to the extent of using military tactics in carrying on their crimes, and they are also gradually with time growing much stronger and harder to clamp down on. Therefore, it's hard to track these types of crimes. We believe that it is only when you use these very soldiers that know these military tactics that you are able to clamp down on these criminals and get the job done. On status quo, then, right, we believe that in status quo, the most common alternative to go solve these types of organized crime is having one heavy expenditure on fighting organized crime, for example, in South America or Mexico. And this in and of itself takes a lot of human labor to take down on these people, for example, pumping out police from the streets to go into fighting organized crime and clamping down on them. And often than not, right, we think this leads to more things like losing more lives of people, which is more politically unpopular. I'll get into this more later. But we believe that the very harm of this in general is that these very police that go into fighting these organized crime could have been policing the streets and protecting the people, but instead they go into this very project, and therefore you put a time lag on all the other problems, solving domestic local crimes happening on the street. And so this is something that is way more time-consuming and bureaucratic on their side of the house. On account of factor, then generally we only are going to use mercenaries only when it's necessary, when organized crimes are doing large and very harmful, large-scale stuff to very vulnerable groups of people. On a comparative, opposition needs to defend a world when they fight organized crime with other alternatives. This debate comes down to which mechanism is better. On the stakeholder analysis, then, 3 things. Firstly, on the state, right, we believe that they have the incentive and obligation to protect the people on the ground. They actively achieve this through mercenaries, right? We believe that in our side of the house, we have to see that we have this very money in order to pump out the best types of people in of itself to solve all of these problems of organized crime and the status quo. Secondly, on mercenaries, right, we believe that they're the people that were in their only role as the job is to carry out and do whatever their employer tells them to do. Therefore, quality work will be done. This will be fleshed out more later on. But also on the people on the ground more specifically, they also are the ones that are funding the government and the state. Therefore, they want their taxpayer money and dollars to be put to good use. Therefore, it's up to the state on both sides of the house strategically use these funds. We think this is only if it will be done through proposition. I'll take the POI before I move on.
If you aren't willing to allow mercenaries to breach conventional restrictions placed upon police officers, what is the difference between them and the police?
The difference between them and the police is that the police doesn't know the military tactics, and they also have better jobs that they could do instead of going into solving highly organized crime. I'll go into this in my arguments, right? Why are mercenaries the best means to solve organized crime as opposed to other alternatives like the police? On a mechanism, this is having mercenaries having to get intel on organized crimes and clamping down on them strategically to whatever means necessary. And the reason why they're the best alternative possible as compared to what opposition might provide is that because they're profit oriented, and so they're more likely to do a better job since that's their only role to mercenary, and because they already have the information they have in and of itself by virtue of their experience in the military, they also know try the tactics that these very organized crimes have. For example, right now mercenaries have the larger capability to infiltrate these types of groups of organized crime since they have the information prior, therefore taking them down using the tactics that they already know. The comparative then in like opposition is that when you use the police, you truly like high expenditures. You're only going to not only like take away these police from like the domestic streets where they could have been like solving crimes that are wherein people are like pickpocketing each other, but they also don't know the exact information that these organized crimes have, wherein because they only have experience in like treating with criminals that like rob stores instead of like people who rob stuff like cocaine and cartels, for example, right? And sort of that's the very difference between like the both alternatives in today's debate. I hope that answers you why. Secondly, then, right, on the argument, the comparative then if we use the police, that you're also likely to use life. And this will go a bit into like how the people on the ground will not be happy with this. No, thank you. Also, because of the very fact that police don't know a lot about like organized crime and they're less experienced in the they're more likely to like lose out and die in like a mission. Therefore, it's very politically unpopular, and therefore the people on the ground would not be happy with this. Their taxpayer money and they're being put to like a strategic use, and because they're the main people on the front lines that only have the role that are expected to take care of the people on the ground. And now that they're dead, the people will be angry against this, and therefore they'll riot. And now what the reason why using mercenaries is better is because they tend to be more disposable and outside the house as opposed to using the police. Henceforth, we also like appeal to the people on the ground as the government. The second argument then is on fracturing. This assumes our worst case because even if we fail as a mercenary, we still have like the benefits on outside the house. Because in outside the house, specifically to mercenaries, organized crime would have to be more wary in the case where like either you fail or succeed because one of their peoples might betray them and turn them into like the government, right? And so in the long run, regardless of whether or not they fail, it decreases the trust and decrease the trust amongst the organized crime in itself, and therefore it decentralizes groups of like these criminals. And so in conclusion, whether or not the mission succeeds, the organized crime will more likely to fracture. That's where it like slowing down their growth in the end of the day, which stagnates like them growing and becoming way more harder to crack down in the future. So therefore, this also proves like the whole sustainability of our proposal in of itself as opposed to using large groups of police that probably won't get the job done. As a conclusion, right, we've already told you in general how we like why are mercenaries the best reasons are the best alternative to solve these kind of criminals, and why police in of itself is something that's not going to get a job done, and also in the end of the day will not be politically popular for the government in of itself. And for all the reasons, I rest my case.
All right, I want to thank the first speaker from the proposition bench for that speech, and now to begin the case for the opposition bench, inviting the first opposition speaker. Thank you.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, just give me a second. I'll be going in 3, 2, 1. Panel, mercenaries were painted as the only means necessary to fight organized crime. But I think it's time to call it out for what it truly was, a problem-solution mismatch where you only caused more violence, which resulted in a bigger rift between these communities and their law enforcement agencies. They only made the problem worse. A setup coming out from opposition. I'll have 4 things here. Firstly, what do these mercenaries look like? We think they're military trained, so they come from military backgrounds, and so they were either removed from these military backgrounds because of unethical actions, or they were discharged because they retired and moved on to private contracts. They are individuals who are engineered to take the most efficient and harsh solutions. This looks like Blackwater popularity accused of war crimes in Iran and Iraq. They are engineered so that they can take the most efficient and most brutal approach to solving organized crime, and I'll be proving about how this exacerbates the problem in status quo. Secondly, about what legal restrictions do they truly face. Mercenaries are individuals who don't face any legal restrictions because their structural incentive is the promised money in the contract. For this looks like they frame themselves as military consultants and hence make it hard to hold them legally accountable since they operate with lack of transparency anyways in status quo. Secondly, police have more legal restrictions and can't operate so freely. So we think that the underlying problem is made worse on opposition side because the only difference you get is that they are more violent forms of law enforcement, and as a result of limited ability and results in more perpetuated violence, and law enforcement officers are basically trained to de-escalate the situation without double guessing or second guessing whatever they did. What is the problem right now in status quo? We think the crux of the problem was that cartels and gangs won over the people and these communities by increased amounts of generosity, but also use the violence conducted by law enforcement agencies to their advantage. So this looks like El Salvador and every drug bust literally means civilians on the street killed. It is used by cartels to instill mistrust in law enforcement agencies. And you think you make it worse because there's just more violence on proposition side, in which literally now like these cartels and gangs are going to use more generosity, and they're going to paint these law enforcement agencies and like unempathetic, and they don't like support the community. But what do we support on our side of the house? This is the last point. We support current law enforcement agencies and officers and want to concentrate funds towards police reform instead of hiring mercenaries. This looks like them being given like training on how to be like better at solving these problems and how to properly conduct searches without having more amounts of casualties. And we basically train them to be better law enforcement agencies with like better empathy and like better like problem solving skills. But onto my rebuttals and callouts. I think I have two callouts. Firstly, they talked about how there's going to be heavy government relation, but mercenaries like operate as shadow groups and won't like literally have no transparency because their contract states so. They're military consultants and they can't be like legally held. I think the worst part is there's not going to be government regulation to some extent because these governments need this problem to be effectively solved, and that's why they're not going to give them any like legal implications or like any like ramifications if they do something wrong because they want the job to be done. So even realistic, if you wanted to, you can't. Governments don't have the incentive. They will only get the job done on their side of the house because they'll use violence because it was in their contract to only like solve organized crime without legal implications and without like problems that come. Then we also asked them, how is there a difference if there's like restrictions on like these heavy government groups? They talked about how there's going to be training and like how they're going to be better forms of police because they're better trained. I'll be responding it into my rebuttal. But I think the main point that they brought to us is about how they're like profit incentivized, and because of this reason, they're going to likely do the job better. I think proposition shoots them themselves in the foot because we think that the moment they have no legal chokehold on their actions and their contract incentivized, they're going to take the most efficient and brutal route to solving this crime, which means they aren't going to think about collateral damage and casualties that they cause, and they will not think about the consequences of their actions. So I think government just rips apart communities by flooding them with more violence, because since these mercenaries are going to fight organized crime, they will and like since they're going to resort to high means of violence. I think the problem gets even worse because now organized crime in response to mercenaries is going to have like better at trained militaries to protect themselves. I think you cause like more violence from both sides of the front, and I think you just rupture these communities at the end of the day. And then they talked about, I'll take that later. And then they talked about how police aren't like well trained. I think the problem here is simple. If they think that police aren't well trained, it's a comparative. Like on their side of the house, since these people are so well trained, they're able to commit more acts of violence. I think the harms like basically like equalize at all. I mean, like equalize each other. But police are obviously going to be well trained because when they're dealing with organized crime, these are not just your general beat cop. These are people who have received military training and who have legal restrictions. So I think we are able to like generally get the best of both worlds, in which they're being trained by the military, but they also have legal restrictions on themselves. But on to my first argument about how there's a change in law enforcement approach, which just makes the problem worse. The premise of this is simple. Law enforcement is aligned to uplift the livelihood of society on the daily, and mercenaries are hired to take out deeply entrenched and hostile organized criminals. Why is the latter more harmful to status quo? I think the mercenary approach is to perpetuate violence, infiltrate organized crime, and take out their troopers on the street. This leads to an hostile action by organized crime, which merely entrenches the current issue and basically fills the streets with deaths. This is the likely outcome because organized crime was built and maintained on violence. But secondly, the comparative approach fueled by a counterfactual is that more funding to training and law enforcement officers who stand and patrol and protect these communities are now better at taking down these problems. And basically taking it down is a long-lasting effort. Like, for example, the war on drugs was continuously failed as a result of how entrenched organized crime is, and about how rival gangs literally just replace each other in status quo, and it's like taking it out in a perpetual manner. Hence, this debate cannot be about taking down organized crime. It's simply unfeasible. Rather, it should be about mitigating the harms of the existence, primarily like violence, and a community which works with them out of hate and distrust, and hate and distrust for law enforcement companies. We prioritize we prioritize the de-escalation of shootouts on the daily in favor of talks with organized crime gangs, for example, in Salvador, to curb violence and rebuild trust in the short term. The impacting here is simple. We think that since these individuals are likely to be better trained on our side of the house, and they've also got legal restrictions, they're able to solve better, better solve these crimes, which are instilled in status quo, and there's more trust within these communities, leading me to my second argument about how the problem is not a resource issue, nor is it about the amount of officers. It's about how the police are not trusted by the individuals. But before that, I'll take a point. No points. Okay, onto the first step about how the problem is not existent because of less amount of officers or the type of officers. It's rather about the approach to it. We think kind of the entire problem of organized crime being so deeply prevalent in society is because about how law enforcement agencies use violence to solve these problems. But I think it gets deeper. The entire problem solution mismatch was that violence perpetuated a horrid image of the police in these communities, which is used by these organized crime groups to paint the image of these cops as individuals without empathy. Leading me to my second layer about how the mercenary approach is harmful and does not solve anything. We think it's simple to the extent in which, since these mercenaries now use an extreme form of violence without second guessing their ethical reasons, that's the moment it breeds more mistrust. You literally help organized crime who will use extreme forms of law enforcement to their advantage and further use the community's hatred for these law enforcement to expand their empires. However, the nuance here is deeper. We think the organized crime people will use generosity to win over the community and will act as a form of shelter for these people, which means the moment you use more violence, that's the moment you're pushing more people towards going towards the cartels. I'll be giving the comparative about how you just get more violence and does not solve the problem. I think more violence did not equate to more help. On their side of the house, the moment you use more violence, you create a rupture between these communities and the law enforcement agencies. On our side of the house, you've got better trained professionals who are able to solve the problem better. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, the first opposition speaker for that speech. To continue the case for Gov Bench, inviting the second government speaker here.
Hi, am I on?
Yep, you are.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Organized crime is a cancer sucking the blood out of countries all across the world. Cartels in South America displaced and dismember families. Human trafficking groups poach humans and sell them in markets like they're animals. Yet despite years of funding our police force with billions and billions of dollars, we've only seen a growth in the authority and the power of organized crime. I'm going to engage with our case, which is incredibly self-destructive. Manasvin's counter mechanism sinks the entirety of GovOp's case because he tells you that they're going to concentrate funds towards police reform and increase training and equipment. I think this is absolutely fatal towards OP. It's going to sink their whole bench. I'm going to talk about it in my first argument. Secondly, I think D talks about how these mercenary groups are going to be completely violent and profit incentivized. Note how this was absolutely assertive and negligent of Andrea's framing of regulation, because we tell you that we're going to regulate and monitor these mercenary groups. So obviously they're going to not be rogue spec op operations that are going to be occurring. Secondly, you're probably not going to see them completely violate human rights as opposition suggests. In reality, you're probably going to see things like more hardened, more strengthened military tactics instead of using things like beat cops trying to walk in with Glock 18s trying to take out cartels. I think then the reason as to why there's an even greater incentive here for them to want to align themselves within things like basic human rights, or for them to want to abide towards these basic laws, is because mercenary groups are literally expandable. These are people whom are going to be relying upon government contracts. Governments themselves have an incentive to want to appease people. If you see things like reports in journalism, reports in news outlets suggesting that mercenary groups have gone around genocided an entire community somewhere in Mexico, I think that's when people are going to call out your government for using these mercenary groups that are highly violent. So if that is true, then I think there's an incentive for the government here to want to A, heavily regulate these mercenary groups. So to ensure that these groups aren't going to go around shooting up everybody they see. And secondly, to hire the right mercenary groups to begin with. So if they notice that these groups are heavily volatile and heavily violent, I think that's when they will literally fire these mercenary groups, find another one with a more central and one that is more trustable. Third thing that Manasvin told you about how you're probably going to use things like generosity to combat these communities. I think this maybe worked in about how you're going to combat these communities, and thus it's harder to do things for mercenary groups to infiltrate. I think firstly, it's important to note that this is
Points.
completely symmetric on both sides of the house, because note how things like community groups and like how communities and mafia groups like work together and cartels syncing together is going to be parallel on both sides. But secondly, I think this analysis coming from Op is probably a little bit of a reach, right? Because I'm uninclined to believe that people on the ground are going to want to look up towards cartels that have literally displaced their families. I think cartels and things like organized crime groups, like human trafficking groups, are absolutely hated in their communities. So I'm unclear as to what is the incentive for these groups to what's the incentive for the people on the ground to want to align themselves with these
On that
groups.
point,
But I'm going to answer the biggest question from Op here on what's the difference between these organized crime, or between the police and these mercenary groups. Three things here. Firstly, better training and experience. What are we talking about when we talk about experience, right? We're talking about things like combat experience that they've had. Because note how that these are probably people who are going to be paramilitary, or people who were once in the military who left to get higher profits. It's not because they were kicked out of the military. I think that's absolutely assertive, but it's more so because they could get higher profits when they worked for a mercenary group. So these are people who have been deployed in countries like the Middle East. They know what goes on and they understand military tactics. Secondly, you got things like better equipment, right? The reason you probably have better equipment because of the money that mercenary groups have. They're getting paid a lot in contracts. So this money can be used for them to purchase things like military grade
On that
equipment, which can be used to more effectively combat these cartels and reduce things like human life. So human loss. So they can probably get like better quality Kevlar like Kevlar body vests. They can probably get things like more higher quality helmets, right? Third biggest difference here, I think it's the fact that these mercenary groups have a greater understanding of organized crimes and how they function. So take a look at things like cartels in Mexico. The Sinaloa cartel has literally become a paramilitary group right now. They've got things like tanks. They've got things like armored vehicles. They function like a military, and their tactics are guerrilla warfare like. Note how these paramilitary groups and these mercenary groups have been deployed in such places, in countries like Venezuela, in countries in the Middle East. So they have a greater understanding of these tactics compared to your average local B Corp who probably hasn't even been in a combat situation to begin with. But I'm going to talk about my first argument here, which is going to be a direct comparative with Ops' claim that they were going to rather now fund the police more and train them better. I'm going to talk about why by switching the role of combating organized crime, we allow for the demilitarization of police. First layer of analysis here on why is our police heavily militarized right now. Three things. Firstly, it's because of the purchase of things like heavy weapons from military surpluses. So in countries like the US or the UK, where they've been a part of active warfare in the Middle East, their militaries have a surplus of older equipment, which is then purchased by their respective police forces. So the need for things like heavy equipment for combat or organized crime exists on both sides, right? But we think that right now the increase in the violence of organized crime has warranted things like increased purchase of heavy equipment. So things like refitted grenade launchers, tanks that are repurposed to fight cartels. We think all of these factors create a demand for military equipment. So during the war on drugs, the US police increasingly militarized itself, suggesting they needed to fight crack users with tanks. Thirdly, is because of the fact that there's a justification from the police towards taxpayers. So the police basically use the justification of increased violence of organized crime to need to fight these organized crimes. Thus, the legitimate claims from the police, they have like legitimate claims towards institutions like Congress to increase state expenditure on the police, ultimately letting them to buy more military equipment. But secondly, on why mercenaries lead to a decreasing militarization. I think the reason why you get decreasing militarization is very, very simple. You simply reduce the demand for heavy military grade equipment. The reason as to why this exists is because you've shifted the role of who's going to be combating these organized crimes. So you no longer, take a point. Wait, Varun, you're muted.
Assuming it's so hard to take down organized crimes networks like you reiterate, are you not for the odd counterfactual in which that funding is rediverted into de-escalating violence through negotiation and uplifting marginalized communities caught in the crossfire?
No, that's the thing. That's not effective because note how cartels will literally just find other communities to go and leech off of. You're telling me that by uplifting these communities, you're going to take away the biggest consumer of their products? No, they're just going to ship out their cocaine to other countries. They're going to get people high in other places. I don't understand how by uplifting these communities you reduce the amount of reach that cartels have. I think secondly, the reason as to why we have decreasing militarization is because the police is no longer going to be able to have the justification of having to fight organized crime. So insofar as there's no demand there, then there's no supply of military equipment. But what's the importance of decreasing militarization? It's very simple. Firstly, you improve public relations between the people and the police. Right now, people are fearful of the police because they walk around in riot gear and drive around in literal tanks. I think that's when people are unwilling to align themselves with the police, and that's when they're unwilling to talk with the police. But I think when you demilitarize the police, you make them seem comparatively more approachable and less hostile. I think that's when people have better relations with the police. Secondly, you improve the rights of the people overall. Because note how right now the police abuses the power and equipment that they have and all the training that they're being given. They engage in a warrior-like mindset, which effectively allows them to target these communities even more. And thirdly, we reduce this warrior mindset that is ingrained into these people. I think when ops suggest that we train them with more heavy equipment, I think that's when you ingrain a warrior mindset and a hardened mindset for them to be increasingly more hostile towards people on the ground. I think that's when they fight the war. I think that's when they begin fighting people within their communities instead of fighting things like cartels in other countries. I think for all those reasons, side with Prof.
All right, thank you very much, the second proposition speaker, for that speech. To continue the case for opposition bench, inviting the second opposition speaker. Here.
Hello. I think my PR is still work. Okay. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, the war on drugs failed because in trying to reach a conclusion to drug abuse and the drug epidemic within the United States and other regions, the state and governments forgot to take a step back and examine the underlying reasons for why this drug culture was so pervasive within these regions. Poverty, unemployment, and a lack of alternatives to drug culture and gang culture was the predominant reason as to why these gangs fostered and institutionalized themselves within these domestic regions, and it's ultimately the reason why a proposition in this debate have a fundamental problem-solution mismatch in how they try and target these gangs. So DPM is entirely correct in making this observation in its own speech that the violent approach so far and that the prior methods of the police institution in trying to fight these gangs has been unsuccessful. We are the side of the house helps to change it. So I'm going to do a few things in this speech. The first thing I want to clarify is just a sense of perspective into what this debate requires. So I always want to do the broad comparative and talk about what the kind of conflict on either side of the house is likely to look like. So yes, obviously, on the side of opposition, we agree that organized crime is a prevalent danger for some people. But the truth is that the brutality of these groups is nothing compared to what is essentially a domestic war that is going to be waged on these domestic cartels within these local areas on the side of proposition. It looks like increased in civilian casualties. It looks like the destruction of crucial infrastructure, things like water piping, things like electricity lines that are fundamental to how these individuals, how to operate their lives. When you wage a war on people who have entire industry and entire profit model is to use violence to retaliate, that is not something that helps the people on the ground. Even fighting violence is something that becomes less efficient. So I want to talk about a few things in terms of the model, though. The first thing they tell us is that this is probably only going to be used as a last resort for the biggest crimes that these gangs commit. The reason this is flawed is because this likely means that you lose the likelihood of you using it in a lot of instances is probably because these gangs do like these big crimes all the time. So this obviously kind of like contradicts their characterization about how brutal these gangs are. If it is the case that they are brutal all the time, then presumably this no longer becomes the last resort option, and it's going to be the fail-safe that the first like alternative that the government turns to when it needs help. The second thing they tell us is that the problem is actually just a lack of information, and really there's no difference in terms of like the police and these mercenaries, except for the fact they're like private and have more information. I want to note two things here. The first is that, as Manasvin points out, this information gap can be very easily solved without the direct involvement of these private mercenaries. You can easily buy or purchase information about like the Venezuelan geography or like the interactions of the domestic like civilians with their gangs and like the ways that their consumer culture like functions. All of this is widely accessible, and you can use it through like alternative research methods as well. So there isn't a reason why mercenaries have to be the one who's undertaking these things. But secondly, DPM also falls into this trap because if police need the Venezuelan context, they will get it on our side by symmetrically purchasing it. At the end of this debate, they don't prove why information is something that is asymmetric. We we think we can co-opt that very easily on our side of the house. But what I want to clarify now is why social welfare was something that was fundamental in response to the speaker before me. The one thing that you need to take away from this is that gangs and the ways that they operate are reliant on the cooperation and the trust of local people and the community. The reason this is the case is because literally all aspects of a gang and the profit model, the way that they operate their business is reliant upon the trust of the community and the people who are employed within that community. So for instance, as a gang, you can't just like use violence and kill people for fun. Like it still has to be a profitable business model. So what you need to do is you have to hire local individuals, you have to recruit individuals like youths into your gang in order to increase the amount of labor force you have and make things profitable in order to do like drop shipments for drugs and that sort of thing. That is why the problem, however, on the proposition is that people are forced to trust these gangs and are given no alternative because of the social economic condition that they're placed upon. Because they are poor, because there is rampant unemployment, that they have no choice but to turn towards these gangs and trust them. That is something that social welfare directly tries to solve by increasing the alternatives in terms of education, in terms of opportunities and job opportunities for these individuals. That means they no longer have to have a necessity on these drugs. So the conclusion to all of this is that for the vast majority of the proposition, like first two speeches, all of their solutions have a distinct disconnect from the real problem that is pervading these societies. So what I'm going to talk about now is a few things. The first is the effectiveness of mercenaries. I'll take you in a bit. The first thing I want to do before this effectiveness chat, though, is just chat a little bit about morality and the ethical standards that we have to uphold in this debate. Because I think something that we miss is that just because like something is incredibly effective, that doesn't necessarily mean, or that means that the state should, like, that doesn't necessarily mean the state should just be allowed to do it because it's effective. So like very intuitively, like during World War II, we could have dropped nukes on Japan to end the war really quickly. But like in hindsight, that was probably something that we didn't want to do and something that we should probably ought not to do, because the only way forward to a society that prioritizes peace and has a stable condition for its environment is one where we don't resort to like mass ethical breaching of ethical standards, rolling in with tanks and rolling in with Kevlar like armor and like killing these people at the start of this debate. So in terms of morality, I think definitely opposition takes the high ground in this regard. But let's talk about the two things in terms of effectiveness. The first thing that we were unengaged from the side of proposition was the point that we made about why this fosters trust between people and law enforcement. The reason this is important is because we already explained that civilians are the biggest tool for both actors in this debate. The state needs people to cooperate, and the criminal gangs also need people to cooperate. The point at which the police on proposition demonstrate a willingness to breach ethical standards, that is something that is likely to push these civilians apart. What does proposition say in response to this? The first thing they say is that, well, mercenaries are less brutal than police because they're more targeted. Two things to say here. The first is that I think this undercuts all of the effectiveness material that you heard from first proposition, because presumably you need to be brutal in order to enforce that effectiveness. But secondly, it is them being disposable, the fact that they're reducible to like bodies, that decreases the barrier for higher ranking officers to order things like more casualties and more higher risk operations that eventually lead in more casualties. So for instance, rather than like holding a cocaine production factory in siege, you are likely to like storm in full force on the side of proposition, which obviously increases the amount of bloodshed that you get. But lastly, the reason this is important is because the vast majority of important like organized crime groups are deeply integrated within their communities. So all of this means that effectiveness is far better on the side of opposition when social welfare programs fix the underlying causes of gang violence. Before I move on to my extension about why this fosters the culture of violence, I'll take a POI.
Your counterfactual has an incredibly high burden. How likely are you on opposition going to solve all poverty?
Yeah, obviously the burden is not to solve all poverty, but as a development towards the like improving social conditions and social upliftment, like obviously the first step has to be the formation of a like functional education system, the formation of like functional infrastructure that people are able to use to get job employment. So all of that is a process, and we don't plan on solving in the short term, like the long term, that's how it works. So this is the extension about why this fosters a culture of violence. And I just want to note this directly engages with the biggest harm that proposition gives us, about the immediate violence. And I'm going to explain why this outframes it. The first thing to note here is that what this proposition does is that they reverse developments in anti-violence. Because what we've seen, Mr. Speaker, is that we've seen a decrease in overall brutality and conflict within these regions. The reason why is twofold. First is because in an increased like the ability for like domestic police to hold these people accountable, but also it is the fact that of alternative sources of funding for these drug gangs. Things like drugs and alcohol don't necessarily involve violence, so these gangs are unlikely to go down those lines. The crime syndicates in the status quo know this, and this is something that is beneficial for them because it reduces casualties, which the state also knows is beneficial for them because it reduces the burden to enforce these sorts of police these areas to a large extent. So what proposition does is that they kill this symbiosis where we're moving towards a society in which like these institutionalized gangs like don't operate with like violent tendencies and prefer instead to do things like drugs and alcohol. what this does, importantly, is that it creates conflict with no alternative on the side of proposition. So it looks like a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability. The profit incentive of these corporations is likely to maximize things like material aspects, like the number of people killed or the number of people in jail. This exacerbates the harm that is likely to happen, especially because the privatization of violence creates a race to the bottom for companies to compete with each other in order to see if you can get rack up the most kills, rack up the most bodies, and that's how you get that's the metric by which your government needs to hire you. So at the end of this speech, what you need to take away is that proposition fosters a culture of violence that is likely to make the underlying problems of gang violence within these areas worse. For those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Did Ernest drop out?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So, back up. Right. Restarting speech in 3, 2, 1. So what the proposition does in this debate is accelerate a culture of violence through the competition for contracts, through the race to bottom that these companies experience when trying to compete for these government contracts. So at every point that proposition pours money into violence within these areas, it concentrates that violence and institutionalizes it, which makes the problem worse. And that's why we are proud to oppose. Thanks.
Wait, did it drop out again?
Just to confirm that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, amazing. Let's start my speech. Organized crime is the root of evil, of all issues in poverty and unemployment. Organized crime constantly recruit you with coercive methods to say that if you don't join us, I will kill your family. This caused so many children to drop out of school because they're involved in organized crime syndicates. This caused so many minorities to go into jail just because they had no choice but to join organized crime, or else the hate would threaten their families. This caused so many people in these high crime areas to feel unsafe that they can never focus on their job or focus on their education, or even if they're feeling so threatened, they do not dare to do anything that probably threatens them in the first place. This caused so many prejudices in terms of hiring practices and also in scholarship admissions that are unsolvable outside of opposition. This is why all of the things that we talk about are analytically prior to what opposition wants to achieve. Because if it is true that you want to solve poverty, I don't think that's achievable on side of opposition, because their counterfactual was to use to solve poverty or alleviate poverty so that you can stop organized crimes as well. But insofar as organized crime still exists, the same mechanisms of recruiting children into organized crime and recruiting their youth still occur. This means a cycle of people constantly dropping into poverty still then occurs. Therefore, organized crimes will always be strengthened on opposition, and poverty can never be solved. If this debate then is a choice between whether solving poverty or like alleviating poverty is the better solution, or actually tackling organized crime is the better solution, I think we are the side that actually solves not just organized crime immediately, as opposition agrees with. We also then alleviate poverty to a certain extent, which is then proving why we don't need to use these mechanisms in all circumstances. This also deals with a large chunk of what opposition says. But lastly then, to deal with their principal argument, they cannot just provide an example of the Geneva Convention and assume that their argument on principles will fly. It's too late in opposition week. But the reason as to why this is okay is because we're protecting so many lives of the vulnerable that are being threatened by organized crime syndicates. The lives of the people on the ground are just so much more important than the lives of crime syndicates. This is why solving crime in and of itself is always the most important thing. We're willing to do anything to protect the safety of the individuals on the ground. If we prove that this is the most efficient method to solve organized crimes, we solve all of the issues that are brought upon by organized crimes. With that being said, let's move on to a couple of issues. Firstly, in terms of violence, and secondly, in terms of organized crimes. Firstly, then, in terms of violence, opposition asserts that it will be a lot of violence, especially to the people on the ground. But firstly, I don't think cutting off their water supply is something that is violent. I also don't see why it's necessary to cut off the water supply, since all we're targeting are the organized crime fingers. At worst, you cut off the water supply for the parts that actually connect to their bases. I'm not sure why you need to cut down the water supply for all people. But exactly because of the backlash that exists in status quo, they are unlikely to commit such bad violence against the people on the ground, exactly because they don't want the backlash. But secondly, there's a competition and more people rising to want to be these people. This means that oftentimes we have a choice to hire the people. They are actually not committing violence against people on the ground. This is exactly true after the backlash that occurred after the US incident of hiring the mercenaries for soldiers in foreign countries. This is exactly why countries have the incentive to not hire a lot of these violent people, which is why then we can prevent a lot of the harms coming from the side of opposition. But the last thing here is that what types of violence are we actually committing? Because we're not committing violence against the people. If anything, this war is a war against organized crime syndicates. We are killing the people that are killing communities. So I'm not sure then why all of this backlash do exist on the side of proposition. Lastly then, let's talk about if it's true that it harms their reputation. Because opposition says that it harms the reputation of the police force, therefore using this is bad. Exactly because extreme violence do harm the reputation of the police force, we have the incentive to name an image. You're unlikely to use it in all situations. You're also unlikely to commit a lot of very heinous crimes against the communities, and all of these strategies are likely to be only targeted against the crime syndicates and only against the crime syndicates. But the crucial thing is, the reason as to why they would commit violence in the worst case that they do is because violence is likely to be the only alternative left. What's the counterfactual that can occur on side of opposition? Likely scenario one is the police have to do it themselves because they have to solve these crimes, and violence is likely to be the only alternative to solve organized crime syndicates that have never proved how they're going to solve on side of opposition. This damages the reputation of police even more and causes even more distrust onto the police because this is needed to be done by the police themselves. At least on our side, we can do a distinction to say that we will only hire the mercenaries to do this against organized crimes, and you will never be targeted. The second likely scenario is that they don't do violent things, and the police is still unable to solve organized crimes, like how it had never been solved for the past 10 years. This is exactly when people lose trust onto the police, because they think that the police is not helping them. The police will never do anything progressive to help the people on the ground, and they're just focusing on other things that they're neglecting as vulnerable communities. This is exactly why oftentimes vulnerable communities do not dare to call the police when they're being attacked by all these organized crime syndicates, because the police cannot do anything at all. They would even have even more backlash for ratting out the organized crime syndicates. This is exactly why when you solve it once and for all, the trust onto the police and actually believing that the police will do something finally is so significant on our side of the house, because the chances of you giving information to the police as a local citizen is just so much more when they're likely to solve the problems for you instead of putting you in more danger by the crime syndicates. I'll take you later. Lastly here, in terms of will the crime syndicates retaliate? The first thing here is to say that they already retaliate in status quo when the police force is going against them, also using some kind of guns or trying to go against them, putting them in jail and destroying their whole organization. I see no reason as to why they would also retaliate to the same extent. But the comparison here is that if you solve it slowly, they have more chances to hold the people locally hostage or have more retaliation. But if you solve them once and for all, in the worst case with extreme violence, and they're just like destroyed because you use so much violence, you cut off all their food sources, you cut off their water sources, you kill their people, whatever like that. You kill them once and for all. You destroy the organization once and for all, and they have no chance to retaliate at all. Therefore, we actually lessen the violence on our side of the house. Before I go on, yes.
Why do you get an end to violence when the group you violently took down to a bloody war is replaced by another gang you need to again violently take down to a bloody war? Your metric was curbing violence. This was a serious case contention.
Because the reason as to why organized crime syndicates grow is because they're being recruited by organized crime syndicates. If there's no people recruiting them, I see no reason for them to join it. But if it is true that these organizations, crime syndicates, will get cracked down again and again, this is the exact deterrence as to why people will not form new syndicates or will not join the syndicates in the first place, because they know the end outcome is always to get tracked down by the police with extreme violence, which is the deterrence that a lot of people don't want to do this in the first place. This is exactly why on opposition, they form new gangs, because they know the police can never do anything about it, and they prioritize ethics over being able to solve these crimes. This is exactly why we win. But lastly, on solving crime, is this actually successful in status quo? We say no, because even if you alleviate poverty, the incentives and the political capital is so much lesser on side of opposition, while everyone wants to solve crimes. This is exactly why only on our side of the house, we're the only people that are able to do this. Hell, you have to acknowledge status quo when organized crime syndicates have been killing people on the ground for 20, 30, 40 years and have never been solved. We provide an immediate solvency on side of proposition, and the human lives and solving crime is always a priority side with proposition.
Okay, thank you very much to the proposition speaker for that speech. And to close off the opposition side, let's hear from the opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible? Is it like clear?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, that's good. Let me just put up my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. For all the bravado of listening to where the problem really lay within communities, the proposition does, in hindsight, very little listening to our speeches, because it's been 3 speakers and I have yet to hear a legitimate response to the prop case line. I think they misunderstand, because the goal here was never to solve organized crime, but rather to take a step back and posture both state and society to do that far, far better down the line. They've lost already. Furthermore, you get no legitimate response to A, the principle of law enforcement prioritizing the well-being of society, and B, the reframing as to why taking a step back in empowering society took down organized crime best within the long term. Manas and Yao engaged with your best case. I think we know who wins on engagement at the very least. I'm going to win this debate on both the practical and principle layer then. Firstly, on the practical, I'm going to take it down with a massive macro as to why the prop fails in the solvency of the crux of this debate. 3 layers. Firstly, this was never a debate about taking down organized crime explicitly. Andrea's response to Yao Ming's POI here concedes to this truth, was frankly nothing more than an admission as to how completely wrong they got this debate. For example, the war on drugs, a Brazilian gangs that ravage favelas. You never solve the problem. The gangs you take down would be replaced literally the next day by a rival gang. Often, this was a dragged out process that spewed violence between gangs in the fight for the top spot. I mean, that's literally what happened when we take down the Medellin cartel within Colombia. And I then see myself asking the question that I asked Sue Pei in a POI, because the metric then was curbing violence. I don't think they solved that in any way, because the gang you very violently took down is replaced by another gang you have to again violently take down. Secondly, this was assuming you even took down a gang in the first place. It was incredibly unstrategic to undertake this as a burden, especially when you characterize the problem of violence as being a problem of gangs as opposed to taking them to war. For example, the Colombian drug violence is a result of shootouts between states and gangs that harm communities. But lastly, then we posit that the funds, like over billions, look at billions of dollars over the past 2 decades in places like Colombia, are best if rediverted in the world we defend into uplifting the communities who empower gangs when they are forced to opt into them because they aren't wealthy enough to leave the community or incredibly desperate for cash and lack trust from the state. We win this debate where it mattered on the metrics it was actually about. Secondly, then, this is a debate about state posturing and the prerequisite to this being the de-escalation of violence. 4 things. Firstly, let's be clear. Fighting organized crime and taking it down are 2 separate things. First, the op concedes with everything PM and DPM reiterate, fighting organized crime was hard. We simply believe they fail in proving actually ridding states of organized crime through the addition of mercenaries. Divvesh's response to my POI as to why we should redivert funding to empowering communities then is innately dismissive. Thirdly, why does our counterfactual, which goes unresponded to, far, far better than? 2 things. Firstly, we refund individuals in these communities with the funds that would have been used for your mercenaries in allowing them to either leave, uplifting the state in general, or just gain some form of financial empowerment that reduces their desperation to opt into the cartel. Secondly, that didn't mean to say we were fighting the cartel, but rather cutting the water via roots. This posturing did 2 things. Firstly, it weakened the state's recruitment effort, which made it so strong within communities when citizens literally ran it and lacked cooperation with law enforcement in the very first place. But secondly, it creates an environment in which they no longer have the infrastructure and manpower to take the state on. That gave us a massive bargaining chip in the de-escalation of violence that literally looked like the state going up there and saying, hey, you are far weaker now and you probably can't take me in a war. I'm willing to de-escalate violence if you're willing to, for example, scale back on your operations, because that probably be the only way for now that you even exist. I think gangs are far more likely to opt into that plea deal. You already see that happening in El Salvador. And when gang talks broke down, when gangs were at their weakest, they were completely obliterated because at that point, the military was so much stronger. That is the point we are able to reach exclusively in our war. This was debate-winning analysis here. We proved this was a debate about mitigating the harm of the cartels and leveling up your town hall, or like in other words, posturing to place the state in a far better position to slowly snub these cartels out. We proved potential for long-term solvency while minimizing the harm, violence, massively in the short term, because you don't take cartels like to war in the first place, and you weaken cartels enough that to most cartels it's unstrategic to even get into conflict with each other. I think we create a far better corrective mechanism here. But we take you at your best case, engaging with prop as to why we deal with organized crime far, far better in the long term, versus the op comparative in which like you likely have a new gang replacing you. But before I move on into why you lose in the principal layer, I'll take you up on that point, Sue Pei. Defend yourself.
Is it really effective to uplift families when syndicates always steal money from the people anyways?
Yeah, exactly. The point of uplifting is so individuals can get out of those communities. Like, that's exactly the issue, right? Is that you don't really have an opt-out. You are poor, so you go to gangs in the first place because they're the only individuals who are willing to pay you decent sums of money, especially when you live in like a developing world with like almost hyperinflation in places like Brazil. But secondly, it's because you cannot leave the community. You simply don't have the funds. We solve this on two levels. Not just we solve it in like the recruitment efforts of the gang is far, far weaker. So they have far fewer foot soldiers and manpower on the ground. They have far fewer individuals to run their operations in like delivering narcotics. They bring in far less revenue. They are far less able to buy weapons. But secondly, you redivert the billions of dollars you spend in mercenaries over extended periods of time, because this isn't like one or two really smart guys. This is hundreds or thousands of mercenaries that you bring in to fight a gang war where individuals are literally pulling out tanks. I think it's simply ridiculous. That money is far more beneficial in actual state programs that uplift these individuals and move them possibly out of those communities, draining gangs where they need, like in the specific instance, they need these individuals most, being like critical mass. Secondly, why the op cannot mechanize protections against crimes against humanity by mercenaries. Two layers here. Firstly, even if I take proposition at their best here, it's hard to buy their case. Notice it's prerequisite. Despite all the violence, their pursuit to take down the new Escobar would ravage it. It was okay because their mercenaries did not commit war crimes. I think that was incredibly problematic because it simply wasn't true. Two reasons then as to why that was false. Firstly, to take down organized crimes, you needed to break the rules. Your best case relies on you contradicting yourself and hence losing on the principal level. Why is this true? I mean, let's look back into cartels in the past, like narcotics agents actively tortured tortured cartel members they caught, going against any form of convention, right? And sometimes killing these members. They were even willing to kill kids on the street at some point to get what they wanted. Your mercenaries are the exact individuals who are going to do that because they lack a moral compass. That brings me to my second point. The methods they are trained in are inextricably linked to disregarding social well-being. Even if you forget everything else I said, this is enough to win us debate because it wins us the principle. Let's be real. We want the practical from Manasvin, but I think it was so important because these were individuals who were deployed in wars. These were people who were taught to shoot, to kill, to do anything to achieve their objective, even if it meant putting their lives on the line. So they do the exact same thing. They're trained to be covert operatives, to drop any form of ethics they have. They're willing to kill children or use them as bait. It means they're able to get close to an incredibly powerful gang leader. This was problematic because we told you the primary problem in status quo was a social rift that existed between poor communities and law enforcement, which is why these communities even opted into gangs largely in the first place, next to all the financial and economic issues they had. That goes to say, you actively create that rift and make it larger. It is far easier for gangs to weaponize law enforcement against the people who law enforcement literally need to rely on to take down these gang members. I think you literally allow gangs to take back the most powerful weapon we have. We win that far, far better in actually solving that rift and creating a far more cohesive environment in which individuals on the ground are willing to work with like the law enforcement. I think only then are you actually able to take down gangs when they have no allies within the community in which they exist. Never prouder to oppose.
All right, thank you very much to the opposition whip for that speech. And to conclude this debate, let's hear from the fourth proposition speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, just let me look through my notes and I'll inform you when I'm ready to speak. Thanks.
All right.
All right, setting up my timer. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So in a world where organized crime is still rapidly terrorizing people in local communities and threatening their children to join them and killing children just like in front of people in the streets, opposition will rather have this role compared to government who is trying to solve this problem by supporting today's motion, which is to allow mercenaries to actually take care of these organized crime syndicates properly and once and for all. So before I move on to anything, let's just have a rundown on what government and opposition has said throughout the entire debate. So government, they framed why mercenaries are not going to go rogue and why they're still going to abide by human rights. And they also realized the the effects of how the harming effects of organized crime, how it affects these local communities, how it affects these people's future. And we also brought up a mechanism as to that we will employ mercenaries to actually fight these organized crime leaders as a last resort. And we prove this by saying that because mercenaries are more profit oriented, they will do a better job compared to the police force. And they because they tend to be more knowledgeable about all these military tactics that the police force have hardly any knowledge about. So we also proved to you why militarization of the police force won't get any better, why training the police to de-escalate these situations won't be as effective compared to employing mercenaries in Deputy Prime Minister's speech. And let's take a rundown of what opposition has said throughout their entire, what the entire bench has said. So basically, they will want to solve poverty, but again, it's not really clear as to how they'll do that. And again, they also seemingly just pushed onto government that, oh, mercenaries are rogue people. They're going to cause a lot of violence. They're going to harm a lot of people in the community. And therefore, these people's lives are more in danger compared to us trying to train the police force and then actually trying to de-escalate the situation. We don't understand why there's so much backlash, considering that both Prime Minister, my Deputy Prime Minister, and my government whip have always been continuously saying and proving and analyzing that they don't know that mercenaries and the government do not have the incentive to do that, which I will also be explaining on into when I explain the clashes. So basically, they want to sort of de-escalate these sort of organized crime syndicates. But obviously, this will not work because police force compared to the mercenaries are never going to achieve what mercenaries can do. So government's role, we will want a world, and we can achieve a world where people in society generally trust the police more, and where organized crime syndicates are getting toppled down one by one more effectively and more permanently. Whereas ops world, they would rather have police patrolling and are better trained to take down these organized crimes because they think that these policemen are better at solving crimes because they have legal restrictions. So why is government's role actually more effective and compared to ops? First of all, we are actually protecting the vulnerable by actually employing these mercenaries. By employing these mercenaries to take care of these crime syndicates, because we realize the fact that if you keep if opposition really wants to train the police force, it will still take time and it will still take money, right? It will take a longer time, and who knows how much training this police force needs to go through in order to actually be qualified enough to take down these crime syndicates, compared to government, where we are employing already professional soldiers to take care of these crime syndicates that are harming our people. So moving on to the two clashes today that have happened in today's debate. First off would be the clash on the characterization of mercenaries. So government, obviously we say that mercenaries will be held within legal restrictions, that they are still incentivized to kind of abide by human rights instead of going rogue at all these people just to complete a task. Whereas op continuously pushes the fact that mercenaries will just use any efficient way to solve crime with basically no regard for human rights, just because either one, they were removed from the military for unethical methods, two, they were retired from the military. So why is our characterization of mercenaries more realistic and holistic than opposition's? First of all, it's more likely because, again, their motivation is mainly for profit. And to get profit, they're forced essentially to obey regulations that are set by the government that are employing them, or they will be taken off of their work. And what Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister has said as well, that the government wants to protect society, so that they obviously would regulate and observe these mercenaries really strictly, because they don't want to suffer from severe social backlash that will be inflicted on by the citizens, because they're going to lose citizen support, they're going to lose power, they're going to lose their seat, they're going to lose the trust of the citizens in general, and they might not get elected in the next term. And also op decides to kind of ignore the fact that we have mentioned that we will employ mercenaries that like sort of well-behaved mercenaries, which have been mentioned in Prime Minister's speech. But anyway, opposition on the flip side has basically not given enough nuance, enough characterization that mercenaries will go rogue in a lot of cases. And moving on to my second clash that I've identified in today's debate, which is whether giving police training with military equipment is more effective than mercenaries. So first off, government claims that heavy militarization of the police is bad and that mercenaries are more kind of effective in stamping out all these crime syndicates, whereas OP will rather give police training because they think it's essential to de-escalate these crimes and solve these issues. So we want to reduce heavy military grade use in the police force because, again, what's mentioned in my Deputy Prime Minister, we want a better relationship with the police, and this is better relationship between the police and the people because it is critical, because we don't want these people to obviously be like, oh, they're not doing anything, are they doing anything about these organized crime syndicates? They don't want to constantly worry about their future and for their children. So we should depend on mercenaries more because, again, they generally have more knowledge about military tactics that they're able to impose to take down these organized crime syndicates properly, instead of compared to the police dilly-dallying because they have hardly any experience and they always have to kind of second guess themselves and say that, oh, should we do this instead or should we do that instead? So moving on to why we effectively solve crime, because crime leaders now at this point are so aware of the strength of mercenaries. And while OP tries their best to cover this up by saying that, these organized crime syndicates will just keep popping up, we actually are preventing new syndicates from forming, because once these crime leaders know how bad it is to get their organized crime syndicate crushed so much, they are more disincentivized to actually sort of form a new syndicate in the end. So what's the best case of OP? There's that the police force is able to achieve its main goals, which is these escalating organized crime, but obviously it'll take longer time because it requires training, and who knows when these organized crime syndicates will kind of be stamped out. And worst case of government is that there's that, of course, that mercenaries commit violence, but obviously, as mentioned in my government whip, it is usually as a last resort thing. And even if it is as well, even if mercenaries were replaced with the police, they will do that as well. So it's mutually exclusive. And with that, I've never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm gonna take some time, rather like 2 minutes